Welcome, everyone. I see people starting to come in. Good to see you. We're just going to give people a few moments while they come in. So we're just coming up on noon now. While we're waiting, why don't you just type in the chat? Tell me where you're joining us from, what the weather's like where you are. Always good to know who we've got and where you're coming from. Good morning from Patrick from Vancouver. It's cold. Yeah, it's cold here too. I think last time I looked, I think it was -7 here. So it's really cold. Although, who leaves the house these days? Just give it another minute or so. For those of you who are just joining us, just let us know where you're joining us from. Starting to worry, Nicholas, smile.
Patrick, it's a cold, dark world, my friend. We can't smile too much all the time.
Oh, Nikola Danilov. I haven't seen you in a long time. Welcome. It's good to see you here. Betty, welcome. Good to see you. And Andrew, so many friends. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to get started. So, I am so incredibly excited to be back. It's been a break since our last sense-making conversation. So much has happened, and so many good things and challenging things. And here we are, midway into month 2 of 2021. Can you believe it? We made it into 2021 and we're into that second month. And it was about a year ago that the first cases of COVID-19 were starting to show up on American soil. I remember this quite vividly because actually I was just getting back from a trip and got incredibly sick and wondered, did I have COVID? I never did find out, but I survived. So, and no one around me got sick, so I assume it wasn't. But none of us could imagine in February of 2020 what was about to unfold. And it was absolutely a year that defied prediction. Just when we thought we were getting used to what was the new normal, something else happened. And many of us kind of hung on by our fingernails, hoping that we could get through the next day and then the next week and then the next month, because it was a year of so many changes. And yet here we sit on a show called Sense Making Conversations, where we're talking about predictions. How bold. And that's exactly what we want to be today. Because the reality is that, things have changed, and the way it was is probably not going to be the way it will be. The reality is we've all had experiences we never could have imagined just 12 short months ago. How many of you have gone to see your doctor online? Bet you never thought that was going to happen. How many people here have had a dinner party over Zoom? How crazy is that? And how about actually visiting another country online? And it's been amazing to see the ways in which so many companies have pivoted, the ways in which we as humans have adapted. I mean, that is one of the beautiful things about us as humans. We adapt, and it has absolutely happened. But we do like to know what's going to happen next. So today's show is all about predicting. And we're going to make some predictions for the coming year. And I am so incredibly proud to be welcoming my guest today, Nick Badminton. Many of you remember Nick. He was with us a couple of times last year. Nick is a futurist, a speaker, a media personality, and a researcher. He specializes in identifying and calling out trends that historically have shaped impactful organizations, trillion-dollar companies, progressive governments, and $200+ billion investment funds. Nick asks us to shift our thinking from what is to what if. And I think if any of us are still thinking about what is, it is absolutely time to be thinking about what if, because that's what 2021 is going to be. Now, Nick, I've been doing my own homework on what you've been putting out into the media, because I know you're constantly out there talking about what's happening in our world. And one of the things that I've noticed is that you're talking about 2021 as what you're calling a year of transcendence. Now, that's a big word, and I think I know what it means, and I'm sure many of our guests think they know what it means. But what I would love to know is, what do you think it means, and why are you calling 2021 the year of transcendence?
Yeah, and thank you, Andrea, and hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. And when I talk about transcendence, it's about breaking through ordinary limitations that we've had. Now, I think that in 2020, we found a lot of contraction, staying in your basement, don't travel, wash your groceries when you get home, a whole bunch of crazy stuff that we would never have even thought about. And you called out a few other things as we began this chat, Andrea. But really, transcendence is the idea that we're going beyond. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it stopped at self-actualization. Actually, he was working on the idea of self-transcendence, the idea that we can collectively rise above a certain situation. Now, this talk today is kind of like a challenge to the shtick that's going around in terms of the new normal and build back better and all of these things, into something that needs to be sort of a collective effort to rise above what we faced globally. And it's not just COVID-19 that we faced. We faced everything from organized crime taking advantage of the situation, from workplaces not having a clue of how to change and manage, from just seeing entire businesses disappear, new businesses turn up, disruption coming in. I mean, Zoom, and we're on the platform right now, is worth more than ExxonMobil now. So it's kind of like a changing of the guard. It's this raising up. It's technological and technocratic, but more importantly, it's humanistic as an approach going forward, where we have to create some equity and some equality in the world. And with things like Black Lives Matter movement and really pushing forward with activism in places like the US and Canada and around the world, I think that's the sort of transcendence that's interesting. It's people, process, technology, governance, government, and coming together in ways that are going to really benefit the world as a whole.
You know, and you make so many good points. And I love what you were just saying about, this being about humanity. I mean, many of us have been watching the shifts in the last, probably 5 years, as we've entered into this new state of the fourth industrial revolution. And, one of my clients, and I don't remember which one right now, had said, this is the first industrial revolution where we're not industrializing humans. This is where humans actually are first, and the industrialization is happening to the benefit of humans as opposed to the detriment of humans, which is what all the other industrial revolutions was about industrializing the humans. And so, we are transcending something that has historically taken us into places that weren't very comfortable, let's just say. Now, they helped us, we grew, our societies grew, our economies grew, businesses grew. We saw capitalism rise out of that as a result. And here we sit at a time when some would say we're at maybe the end of capitalism. And I don't know if that's true, but what I do know is that many of us are now sitting in our homes for the first time as we work. Now, the reality is many people were already working from home, but suddenly many more of us are in a work from home situation, and we don't see that ending anytime soon. As I look at the predictions, as I see what's happening out there in the world, the predictions are that we're going to see some form of work from home over the next at least 18 months, if not longer. And it has major implications. When we look at city infrastructure, when we look at real estate, when we look at Main Street businesses, or even, co-working and education, the work from home, trend is something that has had grave impact. And I'm wondering, Nikolas, from your perspective, as you look out into the world, what do you see on this work from home trend? Is it here to stay, first of all? And secondly, if it is, how do we cope?
I mean, we're culturally embedding the idea of working from home into our society. And as we know, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And these ideas about going back into the office actually seem a long way off for many of us right now. I mean, I'm normally on the road, like, I do about 60 flights a year, typically when I look back at 2019. And I'm on stages, I'm with clients and whatever. And now I'm sort of down in my studio here, and life isn't too bad. I've got a young kid, so there's some shift of priorities and a shift of business. My work is now less speaking and more about consulting. But let's get back to the future of work and that as an idea. It's about shifting like transitory populations from downtown cores, like literally to be at home and maybe doing a virtual commute, which is a walk around the block in the morning just so that you can clear your head. When we actually look at the economics of a downtown core, they've actually found about 5 jobs, urban jobs downtown, are dependent on every worker that is actually in residence downtown as well. So there's a huge economic impact here, and it's sort of a shift. And we've seen obviously things like online usage, e-commerce, and everything explode, mobile usage, and we've seen sort of the contraction of the restaurant business and whatever. I don't think that this is our destiny. I do not think that we're all just going to work from home forever. There are going to be some people that love this as an arrangement, but are still going to go out and want to meet people. It's true to know that creativity happens from when you're in the same room as other people, you're sharing ideas, the mirror neurons are firing. Companies like Dropbox are creating Dropbox labs where people can come in 2-3 days a week and work from home, be productive for another 2 days. Steve Jobs famously said that, those moments at the water cooler are like the magic moments that like really grow a company, because new ideas and sharing of ideas from different departments really leads to something great. Amazon, Microsoft, all of these companies are going to be coming back into the office.
I was just reading an article from Deloitte, and I thought it was really interesting. They've done a bunch of research, as they always do, of course, on the future of work. And one of the quotes that I thought was so interesting is that they were saying post COVID-19, the workplace is going to shift from a place where people work to a place where teams meet, socialize, and connect. And I mean, this is Deloitte, right? This is a company that, yes, they're a progressive thinking company, but let's face it, they're consultants. They're telling us that we're going to go to work to socialize. Now, like that has huge implications.
Well, that's kind of why we did go to work, I would argue. I mean, the open office was built for socializing and was terrible for productivity. I mean, sitting in your basement, sitting in a studio, sitting at home for productivity, it's terrible. You burn out, you're stressed out because the lights might not work, your camera might break, people are going to want to see you all the time instead of just being a voice on the phone. We've kind of shifted a lot of expectations. Now, what we need to do is a wholesale change in philosophy around how organizations are measured in terms of productivity and how the employees within them are as well. So, the idea of 9 to 5, 40 hours a week is ridiculous. If someone can get their work done in 20 hours and they can use online platforms for collaboration and then be productive, then that's good. It's about output. It's not going to be about sort of bums on the seats and people in the office. The Deloitte idea is sort of based in old ideas of, design thinking and organizations that produce products and services. What we have to understand is a lot of people in these offices aren't in creative strategic roles. They're in the, doing the work of the business, communications and support and service, customer success, and all of those things. So we have to work out, who are the in-office functions that need to be there? Who are the ones that can work remotely? Can you even leave Canada and live somewhere else to work? It's difficult for the banking system and other people to allow that to happen because of various regulations around taxation and whatever. There's lots of moving parts. So, we have to kind of be careful of what I call the shtick of the future of work, because it's a big complex, beast. It's like wrestling an octopus. So we need to attack this from like a cultural, structural, and an ideological perspective around what we deliver as part of work. I think that we're going to shift towards three days in the office for that collaboration and productivity, but real productivity will probably happen from home. Or even, I think there's going to be a boom in the places like Startwell that I work in Toronto here, I'm a resident futurist there, co-working spaces and whatever. And I think you'll have distributed workers still working in office environments. They just don't want to be in, the branded office because
Right.
it's kind of restrictive these days,
But do you think, so I've heard, this isn't a new thought, right? Let's face it. The reality is we've been hearing, I'm going to say for 20 years, I remember when, at one point there was the call that we were going to move to a 4-day work week. Do you remember that? And of course, there were lots of people saying that would be fantastic. And of course, what happened is we went to the 6-day work week. Let's face it, right? That was the reality. We didn't go to a 4-day work week.
Right.
And so this idea that we're going to use work as a more creative space, that we're going to get together in a, is not a new thought. But I think with what's happened over this past year is that we've had to shift quite dramatically. And so suddenly, the idea, many of the major banks, as an example, all had to suddenly find a way to work from home, which in a world of high security, not an easy thing to do. No one ever thought it was going to be possible. And they've found a way to make it possible. And I think for many of the major banks, they're continuing in a work from home situation into 22. But, if that's the case, that we're going to bring ourselves back into these large offices, what are the implications on how we're going to do that? I mean, the way in which we can safely do it, the way in which we want to do it. Does anyone actually even want to leave their home? I'm not sure they do, because there's a lot of benefits to working from home, but there's a lot of benefits to working together. So I see we just put up a quick poll. Would love to hear everybody's thoughts on what you think would be actually what's going to happen. What is your opinion? And also, Nick and I are having a good conversation here, but I want you to also jump in. I see Andrew saying, I miss my commute. Yeah, and I think that's true of a lot of people. I know for me, I miss actually just the casual collisions of being in a workplace. But that said, I don't miss the distractions of people around me all the time. And so I find myself in that place of wanting to have an office to go to socialize, but and to even get work done creatively, but of not wanting to be interrupted all the time. And I think I don't think that I'm the only person with that.
Yeah. Do you know what? Do you know what's interesting, Andrea, is I have you noticed, and all the people online as well, have you noticed the joy that you feel when you sort of see kids running around in the snow and you're outside and you're doing groceries, and people are kind of adjusted and they're kind of being more normal in the world, right? I just think that this is kind of a little bit of a pause on how society works. I mean, we've built society from the very early cities for like tens of thousands of years, and really now we can't just think that this virus is suddenly going to stop how we operate and how we're going to go forward. I don't agree with the idea that we'd rather be at home or we'd rather not be in the workplace or whatever. That's a certain kind of people, and it's also people that don't have kids at home and people that don't have noisy neighbors or construction outside their front door, right? So I think that we should get away from this idea that things are going to be out of the office and they're going to be at home. I just think it's going to be a little bit of a hybrid model. I think that probably once we get through COVID and it's like more of a manageable virus situation through vaccination and treatment, very much like the other viruses that have come into the human ecosystem have become over time, I think that we're going to just slip back into a new perspective on the world. What's great about what's happening right now is that it's been so raw and visceral and real. Information has been flying around the world. We can see all the bad things that can happen if we make bad decisions and the infodemic that's flying around as well. And we can see all the good things that have come out of this as well. And I just hope that organizations and their management have kind of got that lack of complacency and proactive redesign philosophy about their businesses from a structural, from a work workplace sort of vibe perspective, and we're going to have something different. There'd be nothing worse than suddenly you go back to an office after, let's say, 2 years away, and it feels like you hadn't left at all, right?
Oh God, yeah, yeah. Now I do notice Zeb, you've got your hand up. Did you want to add something? And we're just going to enable your mic there so you can chat with us.
Yeah, I just had a question because I think what often gets lost in the work from home, what that's going to look like in the future, sort of mental construct is the fact that this is very much the privilege of a certain class of people in society.
Right.
And I think what's interesting to maybe dive into is what are the implications of that new future state for all of those industries that have had this massive and rapid digital transformation. That the change that was going to take, the next 10 years is maybe going to happen in the next 5. And those people that don't have the opportunity just to, sorry, my dog's barking, don't have the opportunity to just work in an office. What happens to all those, the new people who are in this new gig economy, all of that kind of stuff. I think that's what I'm wondering about is where do we give consideration to that group of that very large group of people.
Yeah, and this is where we come back to. I thank you for the question, Zeb. And this is where we sort of come back to sort of the fundamentals of thinking about organizational design and purpose and empowerment of the employee, right? And you're very right. It's the privileged few. Or the privileged many right now that can work from home. There's essential workers that have to still go to work, people that are working on the front lines of restaurants and healthcare and dentistry and whatever. And we're just about to open Ontario. There are going to be a lot of people out there that their work from home situation hasn't been their reality. So we have to have a balance. We have to understand that, whilst technologies have catapulted us forwards, I mean, some people are saying that e-commerce jumped ahead 10 years in about 5 months in terms of growth, usage, repeat purchase and whatever. It does change society. It does become a cultural norm. But then I think there's going to be something that I'm calling a bit of a renaissance, where we're going to have to come back and recognize the foundations of society, which is community cohesion, support for smaller business, support for new ways of working. And these large companies realizing that they've got a part to play, but their part to play is also about support and investment and really coming back to deliver some value that they've been given back into society as a whole. Now, will Silicon Valley and the technocrats do this kind of thing? Probably not. I can't see the benevolence of the technocratic sort of decision makers around the world pumping more money back into society. I think the other day around the Super Bowl, I think I saw a large telecom donate $10 million. And I said on Twitter, I was like, 10 million's nothing these days. If you think about the absolute profits that are made by these companies, this is ridiculous. This is like, just dressing up a bad situation and sort of, our brand is a good guy now. And I think that there needs to be a coming together of private and public industry, government to really deliver some support back into society as a whole.
Yeah, I think you make a great point. I mean, when we look at the care package that is going up against the U.S. administration right now I think it's $1.9 trillion is what they're looking at passing through Congress. In Canada, we know there have been multi-billion dollars worth of care that have been given to the Canadian citizens. And I think what we're seeing is that, suddenly, and again, I'm coming back to your earlier comments, Nick, around humanity. We're realizing that we are a human collective, that we are a community that has to help each other out. And the work from home piece, while yes, it's been impactful because it's not something that we've had to do for the last 50 years, have to, not that some of us want to, but not have to. But what it's really shown us is that we need support from each other, not just because, hey, you're smart and I need a little bit of your brain for a moment, but because we're human and we want to connect and we want to help each other out. And when we look at these multi-trillion-dollar companies that are now, benefiting as all of us are, finding a new normal, we do now need to start thinking. And one of the areas that I want to take us in now, because I think there are some really important implications, is education. We've seen huge implications on the future of education from this pandemic. The reality was, suddenly children were being homeschooled. We saw parents having to figure out how to connect 6-year-olds to the internet so they could do their first year in kindergarten on Zoom. Universities that are now offering their programs worldwide, but still charging tuition at the same rate. There have been so, and the models that are being used were just mirroring typical pedagogical rules in the educational system, but we're now doing it over video. What do you think is going to happen? Because if work from home is a big issue, learn from home is a bigger issue in my mind. What are your thoughts on that, Nick? And I do know we've got a couple of people hands up. I will come back to you.
Yeah, I absolutely have to agree. I'm incredibly outspoken about education. When I went to school, the school system in the UK where I went wasn't built for divergent minds like mine. I didn't leave with much like qualifications. I didn't really learn the way they wanted me to learn, and it's still the same across the world. If you look at what's been happening here in Canada, they literally took an old process, added some technology, and put it out in the world and said, "Well, now you're going to be online learning all of this." And when from my consulting years, I always used to sit down with executives and say, old process and new technology equals pain, expense, and really a bad experience as a whole. And this is what's happened structurally, and from a curriculum perspective, education's broken. I mean, kids need to learn how to, run a business, build a business, understand how the world works, and some practical elements as well. Yes, they need to know math, and yes, they need to know, elements of different languages and whatever. And these are all very useful, and there is balance. I can't say it's easy to fix, but the bottom line is, when it came down to the pandemic, I saw private education sector, come together, redesign how things worked, deploy it, and it worked beautifully well. That doesn't always work, and that's a very privileged perspective. When you look at the public education sector, where many kids are going to be, the majority of children are going to be, my little boy's probably going to be in that world as well in the next sort of 5 years. It worries me greatly because no one sat down and was really sensible, and it's like, okay, let's think about this. And I take some reference from a few people that I've been chatting to over the last year. It's like, okay, let's set up some public television information channels, one per grade, that deliver the information so that kids can watch television in the background, and they can still literally do some work like they're listening to a teacher at a distance, maybe with some connection with friends through social networks. Well, that's a good idea. Why didn't that happen? Because of ineffective, ministerial support for, the teaching, the teaching professionals out there. Why didn't we suddenly think that, digital education is completely different? We have to think differently about this. Why didn't we spend the first sort of 3 to 4 months putting together, paper books, printing them, deploying them, giving kids paper? And then things like Zoom can be used for connections and questions, and not just lecturing. I mean, I've delivered a number of keynotes in the past year, and it's difficult to speak to a camera and get no feedback from anyone, and even try and read a room when there is no room. We're in sort of the educational matrix, as it were. So, education is structurally broken, and it has been for a long time. And, whilst the private sector is managing to, sort of transcend things a little bit, we need to transcend as well in the public sector. Unfortunately, and this is across a lot of different areas of the world, politicking has got in the way of progress. And I think that, it's time to lay down those sort of ego-driven, self-driven sort of political sort of realms for what's actually good and what's progressive. Where are the progressive designers in government around education, right? I'm not saying that people that are educational professionals don't have a depth of knowledge and a good say, but where are the people coming from the outside looking in and saying, maybe there's a new way to do this and there's a new perspective? This is good, this is design thinking, and that kind of progressive thinking is what was needed and has kind of failed. I worry that with education, we're going to get through this, the kids are going to go back to school 2-3 years time, it's going to be the same old education system delivering the same old content and curriculum. Nothing's really changed. And do you know what? The kids aren't going to be in the basement on Zoom, they're going to be back in the classroom, and it's going to be sort of a backwards sort of journey for them, right? So I think that there's a reckoning, and I think that
there's a lot happening in the area of education right now. I mean, we do, as you know, Nicholas, we do a lot of work with the Knowledge Society. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Knowledge Society, it's a group that started here in Toronto by two brothers, Naveed and Nadeem Nathu, who I'm actually going to be interviewing Nadeem in a couple of weeks. And they've developed a way to work with kids in an after-school basis. So it's not even a full-time program, and these kids are doing amazing things. I know that there are other models out there, and so I think there is some really interesting things happening. The question that I have is, is it funded properly? And Patrick, I'm gonna come to you because I know you've got a really amazing point here. So I want to invite you up to the stage to speak. So, we are seeing some of these models starting to come up, and we're starting to see some great thinking happening. The question is, who funds it? Does government get involved? Is it private industry? Is it venture capital? Where does the funding for this come from? Because that's a really important question. We know if there's no money, there's no idea. Let's face it, that's the reality. Right. And then secondly, how do we socialize not just those privileged few that have access to new models of education, but all citizens to have access to these new models? So Patrick, with that, I'm actually going to let you ask your question or to make your comment, because I think you've got some really, really interesting points here.
Thank you. Yeah, education to me is a very, first off, I am an educator. Second, I work at a post-secondary institution. This is not, always that disclaimer, this is not speaking from that institution's perspective. Clear? This is a working experience. Education was short-funded for many years. It had a real serious sales pitch problem. So as a result, the infrastructure that's in the education, if you look at most of our post-secondaries, and Nicholas rightly notes this, there's not a lot of space left. Our profit ratios were around 3 or 4%, which is not what you can do to build capital with when you start at $25-30 million per, to put a building skeleton together. So COVID actually brought a boom for us. It allowed us to take all these people, put them in their homes, and I'm going to be rude here and blunt. And literally what we did is we shifted the IT cost away from the schools onto the student and faculty.
Totally.
And I have, without going into too many details in respect for students' privacies, we have a serious problem here. We are assuming that because you can go to university, that you can have this technology. That's not true. There are people literally, eating ramen rice, trying to get through ramen bowls to get through the week, and wondering where in blazes are they going to get their next clothing. And yet here we have schooling. Mm-hmm. So that was number one. Number two, the other part that I wanted to sort of draw out was education. Again, I'm only echoing what Nicholas said here. So if I repeat, I apologize. The thing that's most important here is that education itself is built around a machine to deliver a product to the market called, and I'm going to be just generically here, a capitalist type market. But when you ask the question, what does the industry need in terms of skill sets? Suddenly you find out a bachelor's degree and a master's really doesn't matter. And I know this is going to hurt a lot of people's feelings, but that's okay. Thick skin here, people. But this is the problem. So I work in national security and public safety and some other spaces. Thank you to Nicholas for reminding me what the dark horse looks like. And that's a very interesting situation. But here comes micro-credentials. Wow, micro-credentials sound fantastic. We put these little bundles of ideas together, and you can see me It's all it is old wine in a new bottle. We have not addressed the issue of pedagogical modeling. We have not addressed the issue. And Nicholas, I really want your opinion on this Maslow's transcendence thing.
Yeah.
Is it, or whatever that thing was you called it. I really want to find out, how does that fit? And how do you build that agenda as an education model for inspiration in teaching? Like, that's where I think we sit. And I quite bluntly, and then I'll shut up here. And then my last one is that we are going to medievalism. We are going back to the city-state. We're going back to a model that, if you look at the militiaman movement and the white supremacy movement, it is a pure medieval state modeling. Their manifestos they talk about the future are purely medieval type thinking.
Well, you know, Patrick, I hope that we're starting to move away from that. I certainly understand why you're making that comment, because it's certainly crossed my mind. But I'm hoping that with some of the shifts south of the border, that some of that is beginning to be addressed. And I know today there's, of course, the beginning of the trial. So let's hope that we see some of that go away. But I'm going to pass it back to Nicholas, because I know that, Patrick, you had a couple of questions there that you wanted Nicholas's points on. So let me hand it back to Nicholas.
Yeah, and Patrick, it's always good to hear you, my friend. And yeah, the medieval nature. Well, there's a great quote, and it was from one of the founders of Coursera, and she said, you could literally take a teacher from the 18th century and put them in a classroom today, and it wouldn't feel any different, right? So people are perpetuating that path. And okay, let's look at transcendence. Okay, let's break through the boundaries. Let's rise above. Let's come together collectively, and let's look at that idea of micro credentials. Well, you've got people like Dyson, the vacuum cleaner company. You've got people like Google and a number of other, online companies, like Coursera and Khan Academy. All these people are trying to give you like smaller little pieces of education to augment what you've already got. When you suddenly get to a point where people are literally building layers and layers of education in there, this fits my life and my interest and where I want to go in life, the idea of getting a degree becomes sort of null and void in a way. Now, I've got a degree. It was the only way that I could get into a lot of career opportunities. And now places, big consultancies, big engineering companies and whatever, for certain roles, you don't need to have a degree. When you do have to have sort of structural knowledge, and you do need to have an ability to do things to a high standard that are certified, like more professional engineering courses and whatever, then you do need that. So I think what we're going to find is, if we transcend this medieval educational view of the world, then it's basically going to be born from the people that are choosing to take a different route and the companies that are willing to accept them. It's not going to come from the educational system itself. I don't even think that it's going to come from sort of the technocrats and the people that are running big companies to suddenly be the new educators. A lot of people in the foresight and futurist community are talking about how education is going to be the biggest industry in the 2030s. And I think they could be kind of right. But how do we perceive quality of education and knowledge? You can be you can be a young female that lives in sub-Saharan Africa and undertake a course at MIT and be smarter than a kid that's gone there and spent $50,000 a year to attend, and on paper you look exactly the same. Unfortunately, when it comes down to colonial ideas of what the world should be, and that we should only hire people from good schools, that's when things fall down. So we're getting back to structural parts of society and beliefs, and I think that we need to start teaching kids activism. We need to start having activists within a government framework to sort of revolutionize what education is. Who's going to step forward and say that the world needs to be different? When we've got things like 4-year election cycles and whatever, it's not even going to work, because suddenly we're measured on the next 4 years. We're measured on the next 4 years. We got to have a popular opinion that we're good people, that we've delivered value. Whereas these cycles, and people like the World Economic Forum have actually said, need to be like monthly review cycles. The idea, there's a spring break, there's a summer hot. It's like, why have we suddenly put these constructs around everything? It's because of the Industrial Revolution. You sort of talked about earlier, Andrea, the industrial complex is fundamentally broken. We're now adding like humanity and biology, ecology to the communications, transportation, and energy, and what I'm calling sort of like infinite humanity. We've got an opportunity for that transcendent moment to break through. But the bottom line is, I think government and the way that it's operating is going to be that medieval piece, Patrick, that's stopping us from moving forward.
Well, I think, just to kind of sum this up, what I'm seeing, and I think what I'm hearing is that, the historical view of education has been that it's a thing in a place. You go to school and you learn a thing. And I think the more progressive and where we're moving to is that it is neither of those things. It's not a place, because we learn continuously, and it's not a thing. It's the way in which we experience. It's experiential. And that's where I think we're starting to really see COVID starting to help us to understand this. It certainly has made us look at education differently, and using a pedagogical model in a technology-driven solution was never the solution. And so we need to rethink this. Now, I do want to switch gears a little bit, because I think there is so much that's happening in the world today. So we've talked about work from home and the future of work and the impact on cities. We've talked about education and what's happening. But there's another big thing that's happening in the world. And 2020 was, I think, either the hottest or the second hottest year on record. And that was despite the fact that we saw fewer vehicles, a shift away from high emission activities, and yet the world continued to heat up. And yet we're going to continue to see that, because it's not something that happens in the year. Of course, it's a cumulative effect. So 2020 was the accumulation of all the 2,000 years before it. And in fact, the 20 years before it. Let's face it, it's really been the last 20 to 30 years that have warmed up our planet to the point where we're seeing impact. We've become, and we're beginning to become, more aware of our footprint on the planet. Water, energy creation, distribution, storage, the circular economy, these are all things that suddenly we're aware of. If 2 years ago we did a salon where we had somebody talking about the circular economy, most of the people in the audience didn't know what the circular economy was. And that wasn't because it was an ignorant group. In fact, it was a highly intellectual and intelligent group. It's just that we weren't talking about it. We didn't think about it in that way. So when we think about the future of sustainability, and I'm going to take us to the place of energy, do you think that we're going to start to see a true shift away from fossil fuels as we move out of this COVID situation, the pandemic, and we're now coming back into the place where we left off, which was our planet is on fire? I mean, does anyone remember that last January, we saw the worst fires in Australia of all time? In fact, many thought that would be the story of 2020. And yet a year later, most of us have forgotten. So what is happening, Nicholas? Tell me.
Yeah, so it's going to be slow going to break free of the gravity of the industrial complex, heavy industry. It's heavy industry that's the great pollutant here. And yes, renewable energy is being developed at a great pace, and battery technology is getting better. There's even new technologies around sodium ion batteries and more fuel density, and more electric vehicles are being made here. I own an electric vehicle. It's one of the most painful experiences I've had moving from British Columbia to Ontario Ontario to try and drive any decent mileage because of the infrastructure that's been quashed because of governmental decisions and whatever. And now, Ford's building, a ton of electric vehicles, making billions of dollars of investment. I've worked with Unifor before, and, even like the people that work in the oil and gas industry, the unions, they don't want to work in the fuel, the fossil fuel industry. They want to progress. It's going to be slow going because you have to remember that the world is basically addicted to oil, and it's been designed that way. Yes, oil was very good in terms of fuel density, and people have been developing new technologies to take advantage of that. Canada's become wealthy because of oil. There's a lot of backwards thinking in terms of we need more pipelines, we need to pump more oil and whatever. The oil price is back up, but we have to have a careful and considered plan to get to a better place. There's a lot of people that talk about zero carbon. Let's aim for zero carbon by 2050. I was chatting to a biofuels lobbyist a couple of weeks ago, and I've been working with airports and airlines and a number of heavy industry players about this. And it's not about aiming for like zero carbon right now, because you're never going to get there. You're going to be caught up with big ideas that take too long to deliver, or the investment's going to be too large. But actually having an incrementally better approach to energy. So yes, replacing a certain number of cars in your fleet to electric. If you can't do the whole fleet, don't stop the idea of just doing 25%, 50%, maybe some more. When you're thinking about moving to biofuels, well, work out how you can do that for some of the heavy industry that's out there. If you can move to solar and wind and to use that for your benefit, and battery infrastructure, then use some of that for your advantage, because it's going to catch up and it's going to shrink the amount of energy in the world that's produced by the old world, the fossil fuel world, and that's going to get better. Places like Australia have got incredible solar and wind infrastructure, with battery infrastructure from Tesla. There's the idea of supergrids and renewable supergrids in Asia and in around in Europe and the UK as well, and the North Sea. There's a coalition there. We're going to start to see this interconnected, interdependent energy grid around the world. It's going to be energy generated through renewable sources, and that's going to be geothermal, which is a huge opportunity in Canada. It's going to be from wind. It's going to be from solar. It's not going to be from nuclear. A lot of people kill me for that comment, but it's not going to be from nuclear because the cost per kilowatt hour is just ridiculous. The technology, whilst you might shrink the problem, is still going to be a problem going forward. And we're going to have this interconnection. So I think that, slow and steady is going to be great. And be careful of this. You're going to see fossil fuel companies, or, they've called themselves energy companies to this day, become carbon management companies. And their story is going to change to, we're managing our output by offsetting and by carbon sequestration. That's not going to be good enough. So be careful of that in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that you just sort of touched on, and I just want to go back to a couple of things. You touched on Australia, having a lot of renewables, but yet they're still one of the largest producers of coal in the world. And they continue to do that. And coal, we know, along with oil and gas, is a huge polluter and a huge contributor to the carbon footprint. And yet we're seeing these, to your point, these companies continue to live in these areas. And yet we're also on the other side, here in Canada, we've got such an interesting story, because on the one hand, of course, I think we're now the largest producer of oil and gas in the world. But yet at the same time, we also have a huge clean tech infrastructure, that's happening. I think earlier this week, a company called eZinc was just a huge funding, and they're a battery technology using zinc, which is a much less volatile, easier to use technology. We're seeing this is at US based, but QuantumScape being funded around quick charging batteries, which would make it less painful for you to drive. They're talking about creating batteries that can be charged in 15 minutes for electric vehicles. So, we're seeing a lot of clean tech happening here in Canada, here in North America, and yet we don't hear about it. Right. The reality is it is a hidden industry. Unless you happen to be like you and I living in the space, we're not hearing about it in the same way. And battery technology is huge. And why aren't we hearing about it? And what can we do to change that so that the world starts to change?
Do you know what? It's interesting. Over the past sort of 6 or 7 years, I've been speaking and traveling, and I've made it a mission of mine about 8 years ago to speak about new forms of energy, the decarbonization of the economy, and the new world, because we know that that's the future, or a certain version of the future. The future is hugely inconvenient for industry. So I used to go to Grand Prairie, Alberta, or I'd go to, literally the oil fields. And people would run up to me, from, the lovely people at Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and throw leaflets at me and they're like, look at the innovation in the oil fields. And it's like, no, because it's not the future. And then a speaker comes on after me, says exactly the same thing about, oil is not the future. When you chat to people that are out there, you can see that today there's an appetite to change, because there's nothing more convincing than year after year of being beaten down as an industry, like the oil and gas industry in Canada and globally has been, to be reminded that it's broken, it doesn't work, and whatever. And then you shift out to like Saudi Arabia, Aramco, like huge oil company. But on the flip side, they've got huge green initiatives. They're just trying to get the oil out of the ground and establish all of their green initiatives before they shut the wells and they can still be a global superpower. Now, what's really interesting is that there's going to be a real shift in geopolitical theaters around the world. And I think that it's going to become really exciting from an energy perspective to look at what we have a lot of here in Canada, and that's water.
Yeah, water is one of those questions that continues to plague us. It's too much and too little, right? So we have too little water to satisfy our needs, and yet we're also in a place with global warming where we're in flooding. So we have this sort of interesting relationship to water where, it is the giver of life. Let's face it, we need it. And we are seeing, I think it's stats that I was looking at recently, that something like 20 to 30% of the population is living in a situation, I think it's actually 40%, living without enough water. And so, how can we shift that? Because the reality is we're melting glaciers. Water is coming into places that don't need it, and the places that do need it have too little, and are living often in areas that are, surrounded by salt water, which is of course unusable in many ways. So what's the solution with water? And it's an energy provider as well, which is the other piece to it.
Yeah, it's one of the most sort of geopolitical theaters that we're going to see in the next sort of 20 to 30 years, I think, on the global stage, is like, who's got access to the water? How can we control it in some way? How can we provide water to everyone on the planet? Yeah, as you quite rightly say, there's a lot of people that do not have water or clean supplies. The water infrastructure, I was reading an article today. In America, someone was trying to attack some water infrastructure, like through cyber attacks online, to try and poison it. And there's, the water, you control water, you control a population, and it's been that way for thousands and thousands of years in modern society, right? And now what we find is Canada's got 20% of fresh water in the world. I think that there's going to be water tanks, not oil tankers, out there. I think that we're going to get to the point where technology in the water area is going to be very interesting. And there's a nexus here: water and energy, water and agriculture. All of these things are interlinked. When we actually start to look at the people buying up agricultural land around the world, it's not necessarily to own the agricultural capacity, it's to own the water tables that go underneath. So look at China, in places like the DRC in Africa. Bill Gates is the largest agricultural landowner in the United States. That's a bit of a mind-bending thought. But we're starting to see that this commodity of water is becoming even more important. And, we're at home, we turn on the tap so we can boil a kettle, and we take that for granted. But there are a lot of people, and a lot of people here in Canada, that have been ignored, that need to have, water provided to them. So there's something really important here from an overarching provision of service around water to the public and everyone at almost like zero cost on an ongoing basis, that hasn't been really resolved. But then how do we balance that with the energy needs of the world? How do we balance that with the agricultural and food needs of the world? And how do we innovate in those areas so that we can use water more sparingly? And the water that we do have is used in the right way. The bottom line is Mother Nature is going to wrought her terrible power upon us, like, breaking dams and glaciers melting and avalanches and flooding and droughts, and it's always going to be there. And we just need to work out how, as humanity, we can be resilient through that. I work with the United Nations on the Resiliency Frontiers Initiative, and we start thinking about this, because it's not only that the last year was like the hottest or second hottest on history. It's the fact that in 2021, this will be the coolest year for the next 150 years. That's what we got to worry about. And it's a changing perspective, right?
I do some work with Blair Feltmate, who's the founder of the Climate Adaptation Center. And what he says is, look, I mean, climate change is here. We can't go backwards. To your point, like, it's not like we're going to cool the planet. Where we are is where we are, and so we need to start adapting. And the idea of climate adaptation is it's a new one for most of us, because I think mostly we're hearing about reversing the effects of climate change. And there are some things that we can do to slow it down, to make it, sort of more palatable over time. But the reality is, we are going to continue to see more flooding. We are going to continue to see more fires. These are things that are here to stay. And so how do we adapt in such a way that it's manageable? So to your point, as the glaciers melt, they will melt. I mean, look, we can't stop what has started, but what we can do is we can start to understand how to live with it. So we are in a situation where water is a commodity. So how are we capturing what is coming from us? How are we making sure that people are, in large cities? I mean, we saw, was it last year or the year before, with all the flooding in Calgary, and that's going to continue. So what do? Are we creating ways to capture these melting glaciers so that they're not flooding our cities? Right. Then on the other side of it, where we don't have water, what about desalination techniques? Because, we're a planet filled with water. There's tons of water. It's just not usable for us as humans. So what do we do?
Yeah. We're going to get a lot of technologies come and go around making the world a little better and to manage our situations. And the one thing that I've been thinking about and I've been talking with clients about is to shift the mindset. And, you started off by introducing me, say, I shift from what is to what if. And there's some indigenous thinking that sort of come in. And I thank indigenous populations like the Haudenosaunee and the Iroquois to come up with these ideas like 7 generational thinking. Look 7 generations out, 150, 175, 200 years out into the future, and wonder what our actions today will result in those timescales. Those longer futures are becoming even more interesting, especially when we're talking about natural resources. I mean, the planet is billions of years old, and we've only really been in an industrial revolution for 270, 280 years. Like, we're at the beginning of a journey here, friends. I mean, it's crazy to think that we've just got this short range view. What about our children, our children's children, and their children as well? What world are we creating for them? The short-termism in the world has created our problem in the industrial revolutions. And now that we need to have this long-termism, and this is why, fellow futurists and foresight practitioners are run off their feet right now, working with, large international organizations and governments and people that work in automotive, aviation companies and whatever, just to try and lay a foundation. If you look at companies in Asia, and I look at an example of SoftBank, Masayoshi Son is the CEO of SoftBank. And he, about 3 or 4 years ago, came up with a 300-year plan for his business. Asian companies think in hundreds and thousands of years. And that's what we need to do. The oldest construction company in Japan is 1,400 years old. The West has been bad at not thinking long term. Asia has been very good, and this is why Asia is going to become even more powerful in the next 20 to 30 years, especially India, China, and sort of them as ringleaders for a lot of the other countries out there. Population booms, industrial booming, and I think that we in the West need to start stopping ourselves from being sort of techno fetishists and thinking, oh, we can carbon sequester this way, we can desalinate that way, and start to think about, a philosophical, ideological view of the way forward as well. And that's difficult. I'm not saying that's easy. It's incredibly difficult, but these are some of the conversations I'm having today around these subjects we're discussing.
Nikolas, that's absolutely fascinating. I can't tell you just how much that sparked for me in terms of thinking long term. You know, what will our country, our company, our society look like in 100, 200, 5,000 years? What will we remember? You know, I do find myself, like, even right now, as I look at the next year ahead, I'm beginning to wonder, how will history remember this time and what we did? Because as much as we need to look forward, we also need to look from the future backwards and say, what is it that we want to be remembered for? You know, do we want to be remembered for surviving a pandemic, or do we want to be remembered for actually creating a future that we're proud of? That we were the forefathers and the foremothers of a way in which we created a sustainable, more equitable way of living. And I don't think we're thinking that way. And I think you're absolutely right. It's because it's not just industry leaders, it's governments, but it's also us as citizens. We need to think that way. Because what are we each doing today that will have an implication 50 years, 100 years in the future? This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for all of your incredible foresight. It has been absolutely entertaining and educational and enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks to everyone online as well. There's some smart people out there that I respect highly. So thanks for attending.
Yeah. So we are going to be doing this on a more regular basis. Our sense-making conversations will be back again at the beginning of March. I believe it's March 9th, I think, is our first one, our next one, with Sherry Walling. And she's going to be talking to us about good grief, how to look at the way in which grief can shape us from a mental health resilience standpoint. So thank you for joining us. I'm Andrea Sampson, the CEO and founder of Talk Boutique, and I hope to see you online soon. Take care.
Thank you.